And we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is Reality Stars Podcast. I'm your only host tonight, Nathan. Thomas, I hope you're doing good, dude. He was on a fishing trip yesterday and caught a gigantic bass. I have the great and powerful Dr. Narco Longo back on the show. What's up, brother? How you doing?
I'm doing great, Nate. Good to see you again. Glad
Good to
to be
see you,
back.
dude.
Yeah.
I always enjoy your work. And then a couple days ago, our friend Exertus threw us into a chat together where there was a lot of like bomb throwing back and forth, and I was enjoying the hell out of it. And then I had some questions for you, so we decided to put this together, and I'm glad. So I wanted to talk a little bit about early Christianity, maybe a little esoteric questions that I had. I definitely I respect your opinion a lot, and this is why I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this, because my early indoctrination with Christianity was so anti-astrology, it was crazy. My mother said that was straight witchcraft, and like in my head, it's still like I would never like read I know what sign I am. I'm a Virgo, but like I would never read about it or any of that's like. And then I know that you enjoy astrology, and you say that it's actually important. So I wanted to hear from another Christ follower how astrology is important and how it can be incorporated, I guess, into Christianity as well. And then also, dude, you're a vegetarian, and you say that it's biblically sound and that's the way to go. I also want to hear about that. So, I mean, anywhere you want to get started, dude. I know we love talking about old world stuff too. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Oh man, well those are some great topics, and like I said, if my audio is bad, just let me know and I'll plug these in. I am outside, but
So far, so good.
Okay, great. Christianity and astrology. This is kind of a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. They have kind of grown up. If they're mainstream Christians, it's usually the church telling them astrology's bad, astrology's evil, astrology's from the devil, or it's a creation of man. Very rarely do they have their kind of opinions straight across the board. They'll each kind of have their own take on it, but generally negative. Um, that being said, all of the wisest, most knowledgeable Christians I've met in my personal life had a deep, deep, profound appreciation for astrology. And, most people think of astrology and they think of horoscopes, or like I say, their ex-girlfriend with blue hair, with a piercing, who was a barista, and that was all they talked about, right? And I'm sorry if that's anyone's only experience with astrology.
We've all dated at least 1 or 10 of those.
Yeah. But the reality is that astrology is the mother of all sciences. You could say arts too. Arts and sciences, definitely the sciences. Mythologies and organized religions. There's no getting around it. So let's just kind of debunk some of the main critiques, criticisms, rejections of astrology. The first one would be that it's a creation of the devil or man. Lucifer, you'll hear various explanations. Oh, that's one of man's creations. Don't place your faith in the creations of man, the workings of man, right? Well, then others will say, well, that's a fallen angel information. The fallen angels taught astrology. Don't know where they get that. And then some will say it's Satan. Some will say it's Lucifer. But none of this is true. The reality is that astrology was present since the Garden of Eden. When God created the heavens, the planets, the stars, sun, moon, the luminaries, right? When he created all that, he said, let them be for signs and for seasons. Signs and seasons. So man did not create the signs of the zodiac any more than he created the seasons, nor same goes for the devil or Lucifer or Satan or the fallen angels. Astrology is a divine science. It's pure when used correctly. You can use anything improperly. You can gain a dirty advantage using kind of any system, right? If you're willing to cheat. But astrology has been present ever since the Garden of Eden. And not only that, a lot of people kind of critique this with astrotheology, and they'll bring astrotheology to the table, and then they'll discard the literal interpretation. Now, I don't think that's the right path either, and we got to be careful.
Yeah,
with
we've
that.
had Micah Dank on several times explaining it, and it's not that I don't think that there's something to what he has to say, but it feels like he is ignoring everything else in favor of like a very one-sided. He says this is basically a farmer's almanac, and that's it.
Yeah, I love Santos Bonacci and all his, we had him on last night. Love Santos. All that stuff is true. It's a higher interpretation. It's a transcendental interpretation. It's beyond allegory. But everyone will admit there's symbolism, metaphor, allegory in the Bible. This is one of the higher interpretations too. But just because we access one of those higher interpretations, you see so many people who pat themselves on the back and say, oh, I've figured it out. I cracked the code. I know more about the Bible than anyone. And that's very rarely the case. They usually don't know the Bible well, only the verses that kind of fit the astrotheological connections. And they're there. They are there. But we can't discard the literal. You need a functioning literal story to make you need a real story, a true story, to make a functioning allegory out of. So I'd also say that the astrotheologians kind of, stick their nose up at literal interpretations and think they've got it all right. And you'll often see that they have a hard time acting on the literal principles taught in the Bible. They very often fall short in virtues. And I'm not saying I'm perfect over here, but I would say that it's a pattern with people who toss out the literal interpretation. Yeah, it's kind of what you get. You get what you ask for, If you're only into the symbolism, like Jordan Peterson or somebody, you kind of lose all the foundation underneath. And
Who decides those things? Why did they make him like I remember a couple years ago too, they had him defending capitalism. I think he was talking against Zerzek or Zizek, whatever his name is, about like
right.
capitalism versus socialism. And I was like, who the fuck put Jordan Peterson? Like, he is never the guy I would think of to defend capitalism.
Right. Yeah, a
And
Canadian
then they had him defending Christianity when he won't even like I don't think he even really believes that Jesus is Christ or God is Lord. So
he said they're all like convenient delusions. Like they're all like, psychological archetypes. That's his thing. So, it's not just the astrotheologians. When people pick their higher interpretation, or less material interpretation, it's very easy to get drunk on that. You see it, they get drunk on it. And they think they're above the literal. Anyone who thinks this is a literal story is an idiot. Okay, thanks. But we all know that's not the case. And we can get into that. But let's back to astrology. I'd like to also add to that not only does God create the signs, we also see that when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right, or asked to leave, right, when they're bounced, God places what? An angel with the flaming sword? No. Cherubim. The cherubim. People need to go find out what cherubim means. And, people will say, oh, well, the churches reject astrology. Astrology is unchristian. Well, I'd ask all the churches and the churchgoers, how is it that the dates for Easter and so on, and Passover, traditionally, How are these dates determined? They're determined in relation to the equinox, to the solstices, and the full moons that, in the case of Easter, right, the closest full moon to the spring equinox, or the Sunday, the churches differ, but they're all using some version of an astrological timekeeping system. And that's
100%.
astrology. That's not astronomy. You're attributing belief and meaning to the functions of the heavens. So that's astrology. Also, when we go into our Orthodox Church, what do you see in the four corners of the church? North, east, south, west. You see the four saints who are usually depicted with first the bull, second the lion, next the eagle for Scorpio, and then either the man, the water bearer, usually the angel. So the angel's a human figure. That's Aquarius.
Is this did you say a Roman Catholic church
Orthodox churches.
or Orthodox church? Interesting. I've never actually stepped foot in one. I have a friend, well, several friends actually. All my friends are turning Orthodox. They want me to go to Mass, and I've been thinking on it. I went to a high Mass, to a Latin Mass about a year ago, and it was really interesting watching something. It felt ancient. It felt like it was from a different planet. Everyone was very polite and dressed bizarrely. Dude, it really felt like I was in Star Wars. Um, and then when they were lighting the smoke balls, watching the whole ceremony, it was fascinating. Is that biblical? Are they really doing a ceremony that is like thousands of years old? I mean, is that
Well,
what, like, did Jesus ever light smoke balls? I guess is my real question. I don't know.
well, we do know that Jesus was gifted frankincense and myrrh.
Okay.
Um, you know, kind of one of my kind of half-baked, pipe dream, theories. Probably some cannabis usage in that
Yeah,
area around
I've
his
heard
time.
that. Yeah.
And the frankincense and the myrrh was usually an additive to a cannabis mixture. So, we know they don't really burn cannabis today, but frankincense, myrrh, two types of cinnamon, and olive oil is kind of the carrier, the base. And they call it calamus, but that would be cannabism, right? Is one of the earlier uh, translations, cannabism, which is cannabis. But
Yeah.
we do know that Jesus probably put a big emphasis on ritual incense. That's kind of one of God's favorite sacraments. It seems he prefers incense over blood sacrifice, and I think Jesus was true to that tradition. His sect, or the groups of Jews that he was kind of closely related to and was inspired by, they were big on incense. Baptism by fire. That's very much kind of some incense imagery going on, and also ritual immersion, but not for cleanliness or ritual purity, but for the remission of sin. So that was a radical deviation from kind of the mainstream church, or not church, sorry, synagogue of Satan at
Mhm.
Jerusalem in the day. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. So there was a big emphasis on incense, for sure. Now, I'm no expert on the Orthodox Church, far from it. But I do pretty much concede. I agree with the idea that they are the true church, but I'd also add the Anglicans on there too. It's either them or the Anglican Church, and that might be a curveball for some people, but we can get into that. It's some good stuff. So either the Greek Orthodox, being the purest, in my opinion, the Greek Orthodox, truest, purest, most benevolent, least rabbi influence, least rabbinical, infiltration, is the Greek Orthodox, in my opinion.
Interesting, man.
And
Interesting.
And then I would say the Anglican Church has some interesting claims and ties that all English speakers should be pretty interested in. So,
Well, I had a friend that he started going down like what's the right word? Well, I mean it's not what I am, just kind of he started kind of going down the right wing pipeline a little bit. And his friend brought him to an Orthodox church. It's a Russian Orthodox church out here in Portland. And he said the priest had a sermon basically about like um, Baal worship and spoke about the Rothschilds and how they were evil and stuff like that. And he said, "All right," he goes, "I guess I go here now." He's like, um, so to me, the Orthodox Church seems pretty based. I don't know. I don't know too much about it. I don't honestly know too much about the schisms between the different, even really how it separated from the Catholic Church and why and which one was right, which one was wrong. Um, but you think that the Greek Orthodox Church is the truest?
I do think so. Yeah. You know, for a couple reasons. Number one, the language. I'd say that's the primary thing, is they kind of have the most direct lineage linguistically. They're positioned to kind of understand a lot of those early writings the best. But I'd say that there's things about the Orthodox Church I don't like. Number one, Jesus says to call no man father, and I don't like the churches that don't make sense of that. So calling a
I've
priest
always
father,
felt uncomfortable about that. Yeah, I don't want to
yeah,
call another man father. My own father's dead, and so he was the last one. I'm not going to call anybody else father.
well, hey man, mine passed away too, so I get it, and I'm iffy about that. It's not a pride thing, but to me, there's a direct contradiction with Jesus' own words in the gospel, not the writings of Paul or anyone else, in the gospel. Now, also the ring kissing,
Weird.
it's pretty
Yeah.
weird, right? And I love that they don't have the Pope. I'd say Catholicism is probably the most corrupted of all the branches. Um, Most satanic by far, most Judaized, and you see that the Pope wears the zucchetto, which is pretty much a yarmulke,
We're
right?
talking about, oh, yes, yes, yes. And we're not discussing the fish hat. The fish hat is also kind of creepy, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's something else. But um, there's only really one schism that I know a lot about, and that's the earliest schism in the church. Um, we can. You want to get back to astrology, or you want to get into this? Because there's a lot
You
of
can go
I'm like,
anywhere you want to go, man. And then we can also get back to the Anglican Church because I'm curious about that as well. So
okay,
anywhere you want to go, if you want to touch on the early schism here, I mean, I'd love to hear it.
well,
Um,
let's talk about astrology a little. You
okay.
know, we also have uh, Psalms 19, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, right? I don't know it word for word, but they show His handiwork. Day unto day they utter speech and wisdom or knowledge, right? I mean, this is the stars we're talking about. So I'd say that I like that the Greek Orthodox kind of have a closer appreciation of astrology and the astrotheology. They have their own, very often they're the church kind of least likely to call some Greek philosophers heretics, right? They kind of are a little bit more proud of their Platonic and even Neoplatonic kind of influences. So I like that about them. And you see in Greek, especially in Greek Orthodox churches, you see the four cherubim. So just going back to that point, pretty much every Greek Orthodox church you go to will have the four cherubim in the four corners. And, the angel guarding the way out of the Garden of Eden, that's not an angel like Michael, right, or Gabriel with a sword. The flaming sword is the cross in the sky. You see that? You know how a sword is a cross, right? The
Yeah.
flaming sword is the four corners of heaven. It's like if God carved a cross in the sky, it would go from the four corners of the zodiac. And that's why we see cherubim. Anyone can go look this up for themselves. What's a cherubim? Because when you look it up, it says it's a part bull, part lion, part eagle, part man. Nobody can make sense of that unless we're looking at astrology. And so that's what cherubim is. So right there, you have God creating the signs earlier in the Garden of Eden. Then you have the cherubim being set. And you do kind of have to interpret that in a couple different ways. I believe that's kind of speaking on the seasons and the four corners of the sky. Because in the Garden of Eden, we know that there's not really seasons. So when God says there's a cherubim with a flaming sword, and also angel is angle, right? I know that's a cheap one a lot of people like to use, but it's true. Angel is angle. And that's actually called the language of the birds, right? Phonetic Kabbalah. This word sounds like that word, right? Might mean nothing to a lot of people, but if we know what we're talking about, the closer we get to the Garden of Eden, the more we have to respect those type of phonetic links. Freud was wrong about a lot, but he was right about the fact that puns was the language of the unconscious or the subconscious. So puns, all these phonetic links, words sounding like words, that's a Garden of Eden thing, because
To
the
me,
Adamic,
English was almost set up that way too. English has
yeah,
so many different weird little puns. It's almost a magical. It almost seems like half the things we say are enchantments, and we don't even realize them. Um,
yeah,
there's some weird word magic there.
yeah. English is angelic language, angelish, Angelish, the angular letters, right? The ancient runes. It's a runic system, and according to Finnish tradition, the Bach Saga, which claims to be one of the oldest stories on Earth, they say that English is the third oldest language, or third most valid, traditional Germanic language. And they mean
Interesting.
it's just a different way of using the runes, and ultimately the Phoenician script, which turned into Hebrew alphabet, was also runic to start off. So we know that a lot of this Hebrew stuff actually came from the north, right? The North Pole, the British Isles. Those are the original origins of the Hebrew alphabet, right? Believe it or not. And English is, some people say, a recent invention, and they're not wrong in saying that, but it's a little bit more complex than that, right? The English language as we know it, yes, largely a creation of people like John Dee, Francis Bacon. Um, English came out of the King James Version Bible and the complete works of William Shakespeare, almost at the same time, about 10 years apart, right? Those two. And that's largely where we get English. And we know that John Dee was dabbling with this Enochian language, which he believed to be the angelic language. And it just so happens that him and his buddies would go on to kind of do a couple drafts on the King James Version Bible, what would become the King James Version. It was almost called the Queen Elizabeth version. And this kind of goes into the claims of the Anglican Church, right? Not saying that they're the one true church, but they have a true legacy, right? They have a true lineage, apostolic. lineage to the one true
I
church.
was wondering where your connection would be to that, because it does seem like it is not necessarily like a newer version of Catholicism, but kind of, right. It's a break off, and King James was an interesting guy. I'm curious about your thoughts on him, and do you like him writing the demonology book? Him also, I mean, having a couple of his wives killed. Uh, was he a righteous guy? Like,
I don't know much about King James. Uh, Not enough to kind of critique what most people already know about him. I would. My gut feeling is that there's a lot of slander, and
I
if
could
there's a
definitely see that by the Catholic Church. Yeah, to undermine. Yeah.
yeah, if there's a Zionist plot to kind of rewrite history, right, then we'd have to kind of really look at the Anglican Church and the creation of the King James Version Bible. The King James Version Bible is the only Bible to date written from the opinion that the inhabitants of Britain, the British Isles, Ireland, and England, were the true descendants of Judah, or the line of David. King James believed that he was descended from the line of David. He believed that he was the right, the true king of Israel. Not many people know this. King James really staked a claim and kind of stuck his finger in a lot of the, you could say, merchant class around Europe. Not only do you see a couple jabs taken in the complete works of William Shakespeare, right? But the King James Version Bible gives you, I think, a clear picture on the persecution against Jesus by false, people who falsely claimed that they were the true descendants of Judah, the true Davidic line. The King James Version is written from the opinion that Northern Europeaners were also descendants of the original Israelites. And I think that's why the King James Version is so demonized, why people love to slander it and slander King James and say, everything was gay, everything was fake, it's all, a lie. And, royalty was messy back then. Everyone was stabbing each other in the back. We're not giving anyone a pass and saying anyone was a wonderful, great person. I wasn't there. But I do know that poses a big threat to kind of and I don't know if Zionism is the right word to use for back then, because it wasn't as organized as a concept. But it really flew in the face of what Israel and the Zionist churches in America would like you to believe. So that's one thing about the King James Version that not many people know is, go look at King James and look at whether he believed he was the true righteous king of Israel. And he
So
did.
is he trying to tie that back? Would this be like the Merovingian line? Is that
No.
where he's claiming? Okay.
He believes that through the kings of Ireland, there was a confirmed lineage that all his historians were able to kind of validate. That showed, again, I'm not the expert on this. Please go, anyone go look it up for themselves. King James believed it was through the kings of Ireland, because he was also the king of Ireland, that he was descended from the ancient Israelites, specifically the line of David. So he believed that gave him the right to the throne. And he believed he ruled that from England. And he didn't see anything wrong or contradictory about that. So, this is kind of a worldview that we're not given a full picture on. And it also makes King James Version is one thing. The complete works of William Shakespeare is kind of like It's kind of like the fictional spin-off series, like fan fiction, with all the stuff that hit the cutting room floor, all the dirty jokes and all that stuff that the people who were in the drafting room for the King James version, Queen Elizabeth version, John D. Bacon, DeVere, right? All these guys. The Society of the Spear Shaker, the Knights of the
Yeah.
Palace Athena, that whole group, all the greatest bards, the greatest poets, linguists. You had Finnish, people who spoke Finnish, you had people who spoke, Norwegian, all these languages coming together, taking all the best parts of the runic-based languages and forging a national language, the English language. You tell me that English isn't modern-day Phoenician. Because what allowed the Phoenicians to dominate? Was it, was it necessarily, they had the best boats, but they had the best language. They had the
Hmm.
best writing system,
Well, and
the
there was that
alphabet.
connection too. The British had the same dominance of the land and sea, really, and same with the Phoenicians.
Yeah. And I'm going to
That's
try and tie
interesting.
this. I'm going to try and tie this all together because Phoenician is ultimately runic. Runic language is made up of shapes cast by the sun and shapes found in the zodiac. That's the runes. The runes are a astrology-based writing system. Now, even if you don't believe in the Northern Europe ancient Israelite stuff, put it to the side. Phoenician's the same thing. Phoenician is also a astrological zodiac-based writing system. There's two runes or two Phoenician um, letters, figures, for each one sign of the zodiac. So each one sign of the zodiac gets two runes and two Phoenician letters. And runic is Punic. Runic is the Northern European writing system, and Punic is Phoenician, or what we call Phoenician and North African Phoenician. So why does this all matter? Well, if Hebrew comes out of one of those, right, or is the ancestor of either of those, I believe Hebrew came out of Phoenician, and Phoenician came out of the runic Northern European languages. Finnish, an ancient version of English, closer to Finnish. Because Finnish is the most phonetic language on earth. And this goes back to the the concept of the Adamic language, of each sound having a true meaning that can't change. And I believe that largely the confusion of the tongues is a process of losing the North Pole based language. The farther they spread out, the more confused and varied and regional it becomes. But the closer you get to the North Pole, the purer the language becomes. And Finnish is the most phonetic language on earth. And then there's also root language, Finnish, Swedish, which is separate, but you can kind of group those three together and say they're the root languages of all Germanic languages. Finnish, Swedish, Finnish, the modern Finnish language, and then English. And it's not exactly modern English. Yes, that did all get ironed out in the late, 1500s, early 1600s. English was kind of reforged and composited, but it was all based on ancient traditional principles that were already in Northern Europe. So the phonetic language thing goes back to the Adamic language, that all sounds had a true meaning, right? So when you say, like, ska, for example, in English, all ska sounds are pretty disgusting, or they're not very flattering. Scrape, scoundrel, skank, skeet, right? Scourge, scour, skill, but you can be a skilled
Oh,
anything. You can be a skilled anything. Scary, right? Scream, etc., etc. This goes back to Scorpio, right? And this is just one little example. Um, that's phonetic truth, right? And English exhibits it. I can't speak to the other languages, but the closer we get to the North Pole, the truer and more phonetic the original sounds, the original alphabet becomes. So, and if those all come from the stars, then again, forget the Northern Europe stuff. Even if you're going with a purely Phoenician lineage for the Hebrew alphabet, that comes from the stars too. So, if there's any Christians, just to circle back, if there's any Christians who don't think astrology is, uh, or who think astrology is evil or something like that, well, number one, we better find a new language. We better, you know, kind of find a way around respecting or using Hebrew. And you got to strike a lot of words from your vocabulary. Oh, and find your own system for the days of the week, right? Don't take that from astrology. People conveniently use all these gifts, all these frameworks, structures, and concepts from astrology, chemistry included, right? But they give no credence or respect to the study, the belief in the higher concepts associated with the framework and the structure that astrology provides to all the arts and sciences. Like I said, all chemistry, all the chemical symbols and all that comes from astrology. So why wouldn't we think that the written language comes from astrology, right? And I know this, I'm convinced, but I know a lot of people are hearing it for the first time. So astrology provided the basis for the Hebrew language, regardless of whether it came down through Northern Europe or not. And also, the best place to view the stars is from the North Pole. So that's another one too. It's like a natural, what's it called when they have the
Oh yeah,
observatory,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Observatory. It is really fascinating to me that they are trying to steal something, I think, from Christianity. Really, Christianity seems that they want to kind of steal the mystical, I guess, the natural knowledge and different things like that from the stars, and at the same time, like the people, so they try to steal and obscure that, but also the people that focus too much on that, they try to steal any spirituality from it, and then it becomes all materialistic. Then you have someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson trying to explain the world to you in like just a very materialistic way that is very unpalatable. I don't
Yeah.
like it. And
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. They the the elites, or at least the henchmen of the elites, the deceivers, the propaganda complex. Um, that's pretty much what they always do. Is they materialize and over literalize, hyper literalize transcendental concepts. So I know we were talking a little bit about that at the beginning, about not discarding the literal. Well, what we see with, for example, the LGBTQ agenda is the hyper literalization of Hermetic principles. Um, you know, the union of masculine and feminine, right? The age of Aquarius. Aquarius being kind of the gender neutral, the angel of the zodiac. Why are angels neither masculine or feminine? Because they don't reproduce, sexually. At least not. Opinions differ on that one. Okay, but angels are usually depicted as a little bit androgynous, right? And androgyny goes back to the sign of Aquarius too, because Uranus is Janus, who is two faces, right? Two faces in one body, and often depicted both as man, but sometimes you see man and woman in the same body too with Janus. Um, and it's interesting that Janus would go on to become a female name, right? A woman's name. But Janus and the janitor. This is a high principle right here. Okay, this is a good one right here. The janitor is the only person on campus who's allowed to go into both bathrooms. Isn't that true? The janitor, right? Um, so Uranus is the planet that governs over kind of this LGBTQ gender confusion thing. because at its highest form, in its least, in its highest vibrational form, if we can say that, um, the age of Aquarius is an age of kind of masculinity and femininity, kind of not going away. Never want that. Never preaching that. But kind of leveling out, balancing down. We all know this to be the case. Men aren't out fighting and protecting all day. Women aren't purely, sewing all day. We're a little bit closer to each other. The sexes, the genders are a little closer together than they were in previous times. Now that's it. That's all the Age of Aquarius really means. Women are going to wear pants a little bit, and whether you like it or not, it is what it is. That's why this whole LGBT thing came out of nowhere in the last 50 years. Well, that's also a Hermetic principle. Uranus is kind of the octave of Mercury. So Uranus is the outer planet that's associated with Mercury. Mercury is the inner planet, the visible planet that represents Uranus when we can't see Uranus, right? Because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are semi-visible or non-visible. So Uranus and Mercury go very close together, and we see that Mercury is also a gender-neutral planet, or at least when we see hermaphrodite, right? Hermes, Aphrodite. Mercury goes in between the genders. If you ever see the planets arranged kind of close to like the Kabbalistic tree of life, or in a way similar to the Kabbalistic tree of life, Mercury is in between Mars and Venus. Mercury goes in between Mars and Venus. It's an in-between planet. Just like it goes in between the lowercase gods and mankind, the messenger between the gods and mankind, Mercury. It's also the messenger between the sexes and the genders. So astrologically, and in the chakra system, it's the Mercury chakra, the sacral chakra, that's associated with sexual union. Not many people, get that. A lot of people think it's Mars or Venus. Mars and Venus are both kind of, sexual or sensual, lustful. But it's Mercury that rules the union between the sexes. That's why we see.
Uh-oh. Hopefully, that was just getting good, man. I hope Doc jumps back in. Let's give him a second here. All right, so hopefully Doc jumps back in here in a second. I was going to ask him, and I'm going to ask him here, how astrology differed then as opposed to now. And I'm also curious about his take on the ancient world and how they were able to see all the planets that they were. I'm curious if they had, in his opinion, if for me, if I'm looking at the night sky without a telescope, Mercury looks like a star to me. How on earth? Yeah, NASA cut the feed. Here we go. Mossad, DDoS. All right. Are we back?
Yes. You hear me okay?
It sounds a little bit robotic, but let's see if it gets better. Uh-oh.
All right, let me come out. Sorry, Mossad scrambling my service or something.
Yes. Uh-oh. Okay. Well, we'll wait on Doctor. But yes, I am curious about what the night sky looked like then, because I've also heard many stories about how Saturn was more integral to the ancient world, that there was something that happened, some sort of catastrophe that happened in the night sky, like uh, that Saturn used to be something closer to a sun to us. And so I was going to ask him how Saturn worship kind of. Uh, let's see. Here we go.
Hey.
All right, Doc. Hey, you sound great.
Good?
There we go.
Okay.
We're better.
Sorry about that.
No worries, man. You were just getting good, man. We were talking about Venus, but I also had a quick question for you because I'm curious about what the night sky must have looked like for them, and how the heck could they differentiate like a star from like Mercury, right? If I'm looking at the night sky, if I could even find Mercury or one of these planets, to me, it just looks like another star to me. Do you think that they had some sort of like technology that they were using to? I mean, because man, they knew the night sky so well, and it also could have been maybe they didn't have the same sort of light pollution that we have now, right? They could probably have seen the stars a lot better.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's why so many significant figures in the Bible were shepherds. The
hmm.
shepherds would spend the most time, more time than anyone, looking at the stars. Um, but yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I'm just curious about that. And also, I read something that was talking about how Saturn used to be maybe closer to the Earth and was something more akin to like a second sun to us. And then something maybe happened, and that's where maybe some of the Saturn worship that comes in. It's where does Saturn worship come in? That there is some weird ties with old Judaism, correct? And Saturn worship and things like the tefillin. Is are we?
Yeah.
So
Well,
what is that exactly?
yeah. We hear about the Star of Remphan in the
Hmm.
Old Testament, right? Or we hear about this sigil of Saturn, the sigil of Satan.
Yes,
Um, that is the six-pointed, double triangle, flag of Brazil. We'll
Brazil.
just
Yep.
we'll just say Giselle. We'll say Giselle is what I like to say. Gisillians. Um, that is the six-pointed star of Saturn. That is the crown of Saturn. Saturn is the crowned one, the coronal king, right? Coronavirus, Corona, Chronos. This is all Saturn, the god of time. And also when we see, Saturn is one of God's henchmen. One of God's henchmen. All the planets serve God. And I don't want to get too Gnostic with this because it's not a dualistic thing, right? A lot of
Okay.
a lot of the Gnostics get kind of drunk on the demiurge concept. Um,
The first and only time I had maybe 100 emails, angry emails, was I did an episode on Saturn worship, and I had read something, and I don't know if this is true or not, that the old god was like the god that you read in the Old Testament may have been Kronos, may have been
well,
the Yahweh. There was a connection there with him being Saturn, and man, people were upset to hear that. And I
yes.
don't, and I wasn't even saying that that was true. I was just bringing up a theory, and people don't like
Yeah.
to hear it.
Well, there's something to that. We know how easily the ancient Israelites slipped back into Baal worship, Astarte worship, Ashtaroth, Isis. These are all kind of the same things. These are all veils that Saturn or Venus, Lucifer use to kind of tempt people into evil practices. Orgiastic rites go more back to Venus, of course. All the Tantra freaks are Venusian Luciferians, right? All the communal sex people, all that weird stuff. And then all the animal sacrifice goes back to Saturn. So the spirit of Lucifer was introduced with the serpent of the tree, serpent on the tree, right? And not specifically named in that instance, but it's pretty clearly the serpent. The word serpent means seven. Or it has links to the word seven. And the seventh sign of the zodiac is Libra, the fall, the fallen sign. This is the sign that rules the fall time, the falling of the sun, meaning the setting of the sun. So sunset, fall time, right? Sunset is the fall time of the day. Fall is the sunset of the year. The fallen time, the fallen angels, the fall of man. all has its kind of mythological association with Libra, astrotheological association with Libra. Libra is the same word as Lucifer, just in a different kind of etymology. Lu and Li in Greek, U and E, or the Y sound, would often swap, right? So Lu, a lot of Lu words are really Li words. And Lu means light, Lucifer, light bringer, and Li, Libra means light. Fleur de lis, this is Libra. Libra means light bringer. To bring, I brought something, goes back to Libra, right? The light bringer.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Light bringer, right?
Yeah.
Libra, right? Just kind of condense
Yes.
it almost. Libra is opposed to Aries, which is Adam. So Adam being the first and being associated with not only the color red, but also the head, we have an association with Aries. Aries rules infancy, manhood, or being a man, right, masculinity. And Adam is kind of associated with Aries. We're not reducing him to Aries, like some of these poor astrotheologists. We're not reducing him to just a sign of the zodiac. Complete the opposite. The Bible is written in the stars, not the other way around. The stars aren't written in the Bible. The Bible's written in the stars. Adam and Eve didn't have a printing press or an ink quill, so God wrote them, the scriptures, in the stars. Now, from then on, there are archetypes, there are prophecies, there are cyclical stories. Things do come and pass, and so that's where all these astrotheologists get drunk. Is they don't realize that, yes, it's all in the heavens, but things also cyclically act themselves out. Never the same, never exactly the same, but yes, parallels, commonalities, archetypes, right? But we're never reducing them to that. And Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, so it makes sense it's associated with the first story beginning in the Bible, right? But Adam is kind of encoded in Aries, encoded with this Aries symbolism. And then opposed to Adam, Aries, is Libra, on the other half of the zodiac, the other side of the zodiac. So Aries rules the first half of the zodiac, and Libra rules the second half of the zodiac, the fallen half. And everything after Libra is complicated and a little bit dark and a little bit, complex. But Libra is Lucifer because we have the planet Venus and the planet Saturn, both in the sign of Libra. Libra is ruled by Venus, and Saturn exalts. Those are the two bad guy planets. Venus is the temptation, seduction, right? Love, beauty, the Jezebel kind of spirits and stuff like that. And then Saturn is the rigid law, authoritarian, by the law, by the code, over punishment, right? Heavy-handed punishment, strict observance to ancient codes and curses. So Saturn is,
And
go ahead.
time is not forgiving at all. Yeah.
Yes, Saturn, the god of time. And, Saturn is the lord of this world. Satan is the lord of this world. So everything material is, in a little bit of a way, governed by Saturn. Saturn does kind of have primacy above all the other planets in kind of authority here on Earth. Now, I'm not handing over, we're not saying Saturn's in control, but Saturn rules the material world because he rules space and time. The wife of Saturn, and shout out, this part right here is straight off Santos Bonacci. I heard that for the first time. The creator. Saturn's the creator. Or, sorry, Saturn's not the creator, but God's the creator. And creator is a mix of the words for Kronos and Jupiter, or Thor. So Kronos Rhea. Rhea is the consort of Saturn, or Kronos. So Kronos, Rhea, and Thor, because God is the author, right? Jupiter's the boss, but Saturn's the grandfather, or the stepfather, right? The false father, the motherfucker, right? Saturn's the bad guy. It's the middle finger, Saturn. Um, you know, and Jupiter being the boss, the author, he authorizes. He's the Jupiter brings form. So space and time are subservient to form, because form assigns meaning and purpose to space and time, right? Creation, matter, the 3D. So Chronos is time, Rhea is area, where we get the word area, meaning space, right? Dimension. And then Tor is Thor, Jupiter, the author, King Arthur,
Interesting.
right? But yeah, that's creator. So Saturn's always been there. Saturn had a hand in the creation of the universe. The Elohim, when God says, let us make man in our image, the original Israelite kind of Hebrew interpretation of that, the mystical interpretation, is that El, capital L, is Saturn. We know that to be true.
Mm-hmm.
El is Saturn in other cultures, but Elohim is Saturn and his henchmen. Saturn being one of the henchmen of God. You know, God doesn't have his fingers where he just kind of moves things around down here on Earth. He has his lights. And his lights and the stars in the heavens, they are what, through his will, through God's will, animate the material world, like a 3D printer from above, casting influence, casting, meaning and purpose and flavoring the dish down here, right? Basically. Seasoning, right? The seasons, the stars, they season everything down here with the flavor, and right? Summer is salty, winter is bitter, right? Fall time is sweet but seductive, But going back to Saturn, when did Saturn come in? Saturn's always been there when he was in his place. Now, the one good God in heaven can't be reduced to any of these, right? We're just assigning meaning when he's giving particular attention to different, areas of life. It's easier to get things done when you kind of facet yourself or split yourself up into different assigned roles. And that's all we're saying the planets are, is God using the best influence he has, which is not brute force. Does God reach down with a paintbrush and just fucking whoosh everything over? No, it's this subtle, graceful influence from above that everything down here cymatically responds to, right? The stars twinkle and they sing. The sonoluminescent influence from above. That's what the stars are. So, and Saturn and the planets, the wandering stars, they govern a heck of a lot too. Saturn being the one who has most kind of rule over the material world. Everything has to fall. Everything's restricted by time and space, right? We're all subject to time and space. So we're all subject to Saturn's governance in that regard. Now, Saturn is entirely subservient to the one good God in heaven. Yahweh, the breath of life, right? That's what Yahweh is to me, the breath of life, the Holy Spirit. Spirit means breath, respirate. Holy Spirit, the holy breath. Yahweh is the breath of life. Every culture around the world's had a that's Yahweh. Like a little Darth Vader noise, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's Yahweh. Bend it, twist it, you'll see. You'll get it. Yahweh is the breath of life. And Jehovah is the breath of life. And so kind of God's favorite benevolent representative is the planet Jupiter. So kind of the counter element to the planet Saturn is Jupiter. And before Jesus Christ, this is one, you want to talk about rattling Christians? This one will rattle Christians. When people
Let's do
talk
it.
about when people talk about Jesus being present all the way since the Garden of Eden, if Satan has a beacon through the planet Saturn, I would argue that Jesus has a beacon through the planet Jupiter. And astrologically, Jupiter is the planet of good. Good, good, nothing but good. The only bad that Jupiter can bring is too much good. Too much of a good thing. Too much wealth. Too much abundance. Too much health, if that's a thing, right? And basically, before Jesus came to planet Earth in the physical body, mankind could kind of come closest to understanding him and having almost like a communication with him by contemplation or by pondering the planet Jupiter. Jupiter is Jove, who is Zeus, who is Jove comes from Jehovah, the same root for those words. Jove, Jehovah. It's a lesser form, more kind of condensed or materialized version of the Yahweh word. Yahweh, no consonants. It's just breathy, very breathy word. But Jehovah, we kind of add a little bit of consonants in there too. And yeah, so Jupiter is kind of the beacon that God sends his benevolence and grace through, right? So we're not reducing Jesus to that by any means, but this is kind of the only way you can fully explain why Jesus has Zeus in his name, why he has
Yeah.
12 apostles or 12 disciples, like Jupiter or Zeus on his Mount Olympus, 12 gods, 12 Olympians, Olive, Olympus. And we're not reducing it or saying they're one and the same. We're saying this is fulfilling the same astrological archetype, astrological prophecy, even. So, Jupiter, go ahead.
Oh, I just have a quick question. So, something like how Zeus is in Jesus's name, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
I am curious with so many of the old stories, the mythos will have something like a flood mythos in it as well, right? The same with the Bible, same with like if you
Yeah.
can go all the different ancient texts. Sometimes I can go woo woo mystical retard on this stuff and say like, well, maybe they're all just telling the exact same story just from a different angle. Is there any validity to that? That
Yeah.
lots of these different.
Yeah, they're all trying to describe the same thing, usually with the aid of the stars, of the one true. Everyone is looking up at the same heavens. Everyone's getting the same story with a little bit of like a regional dialectic, dialect, a different way of discussing or flavoring or, the different aesthetic that system's received into artistically, linguistically. All the cultures around the world are supposed to be very different, but they are doing their best in ancient times to describe the one same story. It seems there was a global flood. And, even in Florida here, this is kind of skipping ahead to Jesus' times, but even in Florida here, the Indians of Florida, the Seminole Indians, claim that Jesus descended and had a visitation with the Seminole Indians before the Spanish got here. So, you know, they believe that there's a little bit of a ancient Christian element to their uh, story, but then also, there's the whole ancient Israelite lost tribes in America theory about all the Indians being descended from not just Shem through, the sons of Noah, not just from the line of Shem, like most Asiatic people are, allegedly, going off of the old kind of anthropological models using Ham, Shem, and Japheth. The Native Americans do have a lot of Hebrew traits and cultures,
Mhm.
and traditions, right? So, well, just going back to to kind of Jupiter, and I really want to answer your question about Saturn worship. I think that's such an important point, is Saturn's always been here, but he always had a role and was completely subservient to God. And Jesus and Saturn were kind of, not stepping out to the forefront, or Jupiter and Saturn, right? They were a bit balanced. And Saturn rules sacrifice, right? What do you sacrifice? Blood, sweat, tears, time, right? Whether it's an animal, whether it's your time, the concept of sacrifice goes to Saturn. And it's when Noah gets off the ark, speaking of Noah and, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, when Noah gets off the ark, he commits the first animal sacrifice. And in doing so, just like Eve, and this is not explicitly written, it's not explicitly written that Eve welcomed the spirit of Lucifer through the fruit. It's implied and interpreted later on. But it's not explicitly written there. We're only given serpent, right? Or draconis, or, serpent, dragon, depending on your language of choice. But just as Eve kind of welcomed the spirit of Lucifer, who is Venus, the moon, the morning star, the tempting one, the seductive one, the shining one, right? That's also Libra, but especially the planet Venus, as it rules Libra. Venus, Lucifer, the spirit of temptation, but also free will. Libra, free will. What is, you speak any Spanish? Libra.
No, but yeah,
Okay.
liberty. Yeah.
Libra means liberty.
Dude, that is so fascinating. We actually did an episode with Isaac Weishaupt about capitalism and libertarianism and its connection with Satanism, which is kind of fascinating. And how the Satanic Bible was modeled after Ayn Rand a little bit, and really weird connections there. But I mean, we're getting way off topic. But the liberty, the Satan in that
Yeah.
that's kind of fascinating, man. I'm making a weird little connection there.
Venus being the spirit, the goddess of free will and liberty and libertine lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just as, it's unwritten but kind of read in, is Libra, or Venus governing free will, being associated with the serpent on the tree, through Lucifer. The same thing happens when Noah gets off the ark and commits the first animal sacrifice. I believe, and many of the early Christians believed, that this was the spirit of Saturn, or Shatan, Satan, entering into the lives of man in a more upfront, personal way. Just as we now have a very personal relationship with Jesus that wasn't present so much before, there wasn't a personal relationship with Saturn or Satan until blood sacrifice was implemented. By man's folly. God did not command the first sacrifice. And, we can talk about Cain and Abel if anyone wants.
I was going to mention that. Yeah.
Well, Cain and Abel is clearly not an animal sacrifice. It says fat, but it says in firstlings. All this means is the first of his flock, the first animals. But there's no altar, there's no bloodshed. And even if God, God can do what he wants, but this isn't God commanding it. This is Cain and Abel. And this does get into vegetarianism a little bit, because the early Christians were vegetarian, the true original church. And the first schism we were talking about earlier was over Christianity, between Paul and his movement and James, the brother of Jesus. But the spirit of Saturn entered man's lives after the flood, when Noah sacrifices the first animal. Cain and Abel, like I said, no altar, no bloodshed, no explicit sacrifice. It's an offering. It's like when you come home and your dad says, "All right, what were you doing? What did you do today? Show me how productive you were." And one son, Cain, was pretty lazy. He was still picking fruit, right? He hadn't progressed very far from the Garden of Eden. very lazy offering, right? And we see that it's really not the fruit that God's upset about. It's kind of his attitude, right? And even before he's turned down, Cain probably already had a little bit of a rotten attitude. God could have seen through that. Now, Abel was fulfilling God's new commandments to kind of distance themselves from the Garden of Eden lifestyle, just picking fruit all day, right? And Abel has a whole flock. He's a shepherd, right? Might even be an astrologer for all we know. He's being industrious. He's building fences. He's got a stick, right? This is how I like to imagine it. He's very industrious and innovative. Well, Cain was lazy, picking fruit. This wasn't a matter of vegetarianism. And even if, there are cultures who were vegetarian and still did animal sacrifice. Most of the ancient Greek nobility was largely vegetarian, and they would still sometimes sacrifice, and it wasn't uncommon for some Romans to be like that too. I don't agree with it, but this is our history. This is our history as mankind. Animal sacrifice was a thing. All I'm arguing is that it didn't come in until after Noah. I don't think Cain and Abel is a story of sacrifice. It's the story of the first criminal. And people like to say the first murder victim or the first murderer was a vegetarian, right? You can't draw that conclusion because just because Cain was offering fruit doesn't mean that Abel wasn't eating fruit, that Abel wasn't also a vegetarian. We all know that Abel, the first murder victim, was also a vegetarian because it's not until Noah commits the first animal sacrifice, explicit animal sacrifice, that we have God saying, okay, now the animals are going to be terrified of you. They're not going to be your friends anymore. You're going to have to hunt them pretty much. They're not going to walk right up to you. Oh, you want to kill animals? Okay, well now they're petrified of you. And that is when God also gives the Noahide laws and says, now you can eat flesh, but make sure you drain the blood because you don't want any blood in your food. And in fact, it's Cain and Abel where we get the biblical definition of adrenochrome. Cain and Abel. Cain slaughters Abel. Vegetarian on vegetarian crime. Right? Stop vegetarian on vegetarian hate, folks, okay? Cain slays Abel. And God doesn't see it, doesn't necessarily hear it. He tastes the screams through the blood that dripped into the ground. If that's not a definition of adrenochrome, I don't know what is. God heard the screams in the blood that fell down to the ground.
Yeah.
Now I'm not saying God didn't see it or God didn't hear it, but this is kind of similar to when Noah makes the first sacrifice. God isn't necessarily watching it happen. He smells a sweet aroma. He smells the sacrifice, just like me as a vegetarian, vegan, whatever. I'm walking into a restaurant and I'm going to order some vegetarian food. I can still smell all that meat cooking and all that stuff. It's still fragrant. It's still delicious. I grew up with that. I don't know if I'd still feel the same way if I was vegetarian my whole life, but I can appreciate a nice barbecue smell, But
I was going to ask when you decided to be a vegetarian or if you had always been.
Since I was 18. So I'm 20, so I'm 28. So as soon as I got out of, my mom's house, I went vegetarian. And I was kind of like a little bit of a jock, like a lacrosse bro in high school. So it was a big deviation for me to go.
And was this a religious decision at first, or was this like an ethical thing? How did it start for you? How did you find I guess the Christian side of vegetarianism? Is that how it started, or did you
Well, it started out with I had a friend who was a great role model, who was the healthiest person I've ever met, who had been vegetarian for years or so before I met him. He became my best friend. He was, he was tough, manly, not a soy boy by any means, right? He's a holistic, vegan, vegetarian, and he had 3 jobs, slept only 4 or 5 hours a night, and you couldn't help but be impressed when you're around him. And I started eating like him, and I felt better. I lost weight at first, for sure, but I think that's a lot of detoxing. And by now, I'm pretty much the same weight I was in high school. And vegetarianism for me, my lived experience was, at that point, people close to me who ate a lot of flesh were almost all overweight. I didn't want to be overweight when I got older. My dad, by the time he passed away, really, really overweight. And that he was fit when he was younger, a lot more fit. Now, I'd say that I didn't want to get any of these diseases like heart disease and all this stuff, high blood pressure, diabetes, all that. And I was lucky to get the information early on that the best way to avoid all that was holistic, whole foods, ancient philosopher diet, vegetarianism, the Edenic diet, right? The original factory settings of mankind. And my friend was a living example of that. He never tried to convince me. I pretty much convinced myself. I hunted growing up. I've killed everything there is to kill in Florida. Hunting, right? And I grew up like that. Never wanted to go vegetarian. But that was what made me go vegetarian. I also have to mention the first family that ever got me into conspiracy theories, that ever gifted me the truth, right? Like an awakening, was a family that I went to school with. 3 brothers, and they lived right next to my school. And I lived in the same neighborhood. That family, they were lifelong vegetarians. The dad wasn't, but the kids were raised vegetarian. They ate pizza and stuff, they weren't like Starbucks vegans, like, oh, I don't eat that, I don't eat that. They just didn't eat flesh. No blood, no flesh, no meat. And those were some big kids, okay? Those are some big kids, okay? I was a big kid in high school on the lacrosse field. The oldest brother, he was a big kid too. I knocked him over a couple times, but he could certainly knock me over, a lot too. And anyone who would play sports against this guy, you wouldn't think that was a vegetarian. Okay, this was a well-fed, grown-up kid. Above, pretty much above average height. Pretty husky kids, like big, well-fed guys, athletic too. And that family was so good, so pure. Every kid in my class wanted to go over to their house on the weekends. That was the house that everyone hung out at on the weekends. They'd order pizza, or they'd make healthy food, especially in the morning, a lot of healthy food and stuff. That family, I had a UFO experience. I saw a UFO with the older brother, and then the second oldest brother. And we went running back to the house when I was like 15. This happened, 14, 15. And the dad, when he was like, all right, you guys just saw a UFO. That means that's got to mean something, Well, now I'm going to give you the 101 on what's up. And his kids had heard a little bit of that, but I was there for when, his kids kind of got like it's almost like the sex talk, right? Or like, it's like the Illuminati talk. It was like the 9/11 talk. And he basically gave us the 101 For me, I was hearing all this for the very first time. I'm sure his kids had heard it a lot before, but now in this context of just having a UFO experience, he gave us all this information, and I was hooked ever since. So I've been onto the truth, the conspiracies a little bit since I was 15. Became a lot more hardcore when I was 18. When I was 15, I had no interest in going vegetarian. You know, I would still make fun of those kids. Even we'd joke. We'd call them pussies and try and like get them to eat meat and stuff like that. And one of them did eat meat one time by accident. Uh, he had some Chipotle with meat in it by accident. Bit into it, took some bites, and realized, from his account, he had blood coming out his rear end, having flesh for the first time in his life. The type of issues that put on his stomach. But growing up with them always made an impression. Not at first, but when I met that other friend, like I said, when I was 18, graduated high school, I was convinced, 100% convinced. You can be vegetarian and healthy as can be. You can outperform people athletically. It's the cleaner alternative. Not this climate change agenda BS, okay? Yes, Bill Gates does want you eating ultra-processed fake vegan meat and lab-grown meat. So we can't
Yeah.
say there's a vegan agenda exclusively, on the Illuminati. They're doing the
It's
pushing.
always anti-life is whatever they're pushing. And yeah, it's not strict veganism. It's not something that, like, to me, like, I'm Mexican. I have family in Mexico. They make some pretty good looking some insects that might be tasty. I might not have an issue with eating an insect that was if it was
I
cooked
don't know.
in that way, like, whatever it is. But whatever the insects that Bill Gates is trying to feed you are like factory farmed, fed all kinds of industrial crap. Anything they try to push on you is pretty damn disgusting. It always seems anti-life to me. And yeah, the 3D printed meat, the bizarre stuff. Like I was a chef for 15 plus years, so I knew about all of that stuff years and years ago because it was the very cutting edge at that time, and they were trying to push that stuff. I remember about 15 years ago,
Yeah.
the ethically sourced and the ethically
Yeah.
sourced meat, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
These
they're
blue
using
haired.
actual cancer genes to make the meat replicate quickly. And
Yeah. Yeah. And all these blue haired Starbucks vegans, right? They don't eat flesh purely for the emotional reason. So as soon
yes,
as they're
yeah.
so as soon as they're given a lab grown meat that has flesh, that has blood, that has, in my opinion, still adrenochrome, properties, they're going to sign up for that, because as long as it's ethical or emotionally, packaged, right, comforting. Oh yeah, there's no cow dead with this. They're still going to eat the flesh. Their principle's not in it. It's purely emotional. And
100%, man. And there's also the folks too that like, oh, we had a, yeah, I don't know what that was. But I knew a lady who was a vegan that was pushing 400 pounds. Okay. So veganism, if not done correctly, can also be a problem. I mean, I remember I was shocked when she told me that she was vegan and she was twice my size. I'm a big guy. She was twice my size. And I guess bags of sugar are also vegan. So I think it is interesting the way he's talking about vegetarianism and being thoughtful about what you put into your body and about whole foods and things like that. Because absolutely, there's a right and a wrong way to do it. Oh no.
oh, you sound okay? Is it better?
Let me see. Better. Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened. Okay, that's better.
Sorry.
No worries, man. I was
Uh,
just telling I was telling the audience here. I knew a girl that was twice my size, and she was vegan. She was pushing 400 pounds, and so bags of sugar can also be considered vegan. But I like what you were
Oh, yeah.
saying, that you uh, I guess put more thought into it. And what type of diet were you talking about? You said that it was like the natural, like what people ate in the Garden of Eden. Was that like an Edenic diet? Is that what you called it?
Yes. There's no way around accepting that mankind was created vegetarian in the Garden of Eden.
100%.
God created mankind vegetarian, and that represents a pure state of mankind, a more innocent, more virtuous version of mankind. Bloodthirst was not implemented till after Noah. Mankind had no bloodthirst till after Noah. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 is as clear as it gets in the Bible. There's never been a clearer commandment. Fruit and herb bearing seed. That one verse slam dunks every single carnivore argument there is. Every single one. The defense chemicals, all this stuff completely slam dunks every carnivore diet argument there's ever been. We can talk about Jesus and fish. Love to get into that. Sure.
Yeah, I was curious. Yeah, we just had that comment roll by. What's up, Brian?
We,
Yeah, I am curious about that. Did Jesus eat fish? Are fish dumb? Are we allowed to eat fish?
yeah. Well, to quote Kurt Cobain, fish don't have any feelings, right? He was a Pisces, so he might have had some insight into that. But just the whole Adam diet is pretty relevant, because we know Adam didn't eat any flesh, because it's not until Noah that God permits flesh. And even in that instance, the blood had to be separated, no blood. Now, some movements say that even that meant only dairy and eggs, no blood, no flesh, because you can never fully get the blood out of the flesh and the organs, right? You can never get 100%. So God's clearly trying to spare his people from adrenochrome addiction.
It's six
right?
syllables.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm good. Keep going. Yeah.
But Genesis 1:29 is mankind's original factory settings. Now, some people like to bring up the matter of dominion, right? And they'll say, well, God gave mankind dominion over the fish of the sea and the animals and all this stuff. And that's true. But we all know, anyone intelligent knows, dominion is riding a horse, having a pet, having the goats mow your lawn for you, honeybees, milking the cow, even. This is dominion. And maybe even some pest control could be included in dominion. But it's not about diet. And God directly slam dunk clarifies this with the very next verse. So when people cite dominion for the ability to eat flesh, they're completely forgetting that's Genesis 1:28. The very next verse is God saying, and then, and, pretty much, period or ... and fruit and herb bearing seed, that'll be meat. That will be your meat. That'll be food for you. That is our food. And also the traditional Christian perspective is that there were no flesh-eating animals in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And that bloodthirst only happened either shortly before the flood or after the flood. So there's differing opinions on that, but the general traditional Christian perspective is that none of the animals were eating flesh in the Garden of Eden. So to think that mankind was the only animal eating flesh in the Garden of Eden, in direct violation of Genesis 1:29, and would also, to be denying that God then grants it in the Noahide laws, It's foolish, and people just don't want to come out of their position that God created us carnivorous, which is untrue. The evidence
Yeah,
is
it's
overwhelming.
that's hard to argue that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There, I would not argue with you for a second that God made us, well, vegan
Yeah.
to start off with.
Now, the only kind of real debate is whether Jesus would have gone with that diet or the rabbi diet, which was the accommodation diet. The accommodations made for a wicked and sinful people, generations, was the blood diet that God permits. It's like a consolation. It's like an accommodation. It's a lowering of the bar of mankind. Because God is, dare I say, rather shocked when Noah commits an animal sacrifice. He smells the fragrant smell, but then he sees the source of the fragrant smell and immediately punishes Noah and says, now the animals will be afraid of you. Before, you had this, kind of Snow White relationship with the animals. Or again, the early Christian tradition is that mankind could speak through the Adamic, pure tone, original sound language, straight to the animals, straight into their brain, and have direct, you know, communication with the animals. That's some vegetarian pipe dream stuff, that's the Garden of Eden, in its kind of highest interpretation. Now, let's talk about Jesus. Was Jesus a pescatarian or even a carnivore? Or, a necrovore? Or did he eat sacrificed flesh or the Passover lamb? Let's get into that. Anyone who knows the Bible really well will see Jesus never eats flesh. Not a single instance does Jesus eat flesh. And in fact, whenever he's presented flesh, at one of the Passover dinners, he replaces it and completely completely revolutionizes the whole ritual itself and eliminates the lamb, eliminates the slaughtered lamb, and replaces it with the bread and the grape juice, the wine, kombucha, fermented grape drink. And why don't Christians, take lamb or beef jerky on communion, right? A lot of these so-called Christians would eat the lamb right off of Jesus' back, the one that he just saved from the altar. That's not. A lot of people think that's the lamb that Jesus is bringing to the sacrifice, or that's him saying that he's the Lamb of God.
In
Now
their
that's
defense, lamb is pretty damn delicious. I, I had a lamb euro this
right.
morning, actually.
Well, lamb is delicious, just like child would be more delicious
It
than
could be
adult.
very succulent. Yeah, it
Than
could.
that's the comparison with lamb. Lamb versus ram or sheep. You're talking about a child. You're talking about pretty much.
I
But
do find that funny, man, that how many people will eat lamb, but they are repelled by the idea of veal when it is the exact same thing. It's like veal is a very young calf. Lamb is a baby, a sheep. And really you can't even find mutton really in the United States. All of it is baby. It is lamb, and they don't have the same misgivings with that.
well, let's just get into the pescatarian thing.
Okay.
Jesus was a vegetarian. Now, he might not have been as super duper duper strict as his blood brother James, but Jesus was a cultural, habitual, practicing vegetarian. The religious movements that he came out of, the John the Baptist movement, was a vegetarian movement that was opposed to animal sacrifice. Right? They preached baptism for the forgiveness of sin over animal sacrifice. Right? John's out in the countryside doing his ritual immersion, not for just simple purity or cleanliness, for the remission of sin. And
Doc, I have a quick question for you, brother. I'm curious about this because the way I was taught that Christianity comes out of Judaism, correct? I'm just telling you the way that I was taught. Okay. My mother said that we were all Jews before Jesus came. Jesus came and he changed everything, right? There's a new agreement. There is but what something that she would say is that like animal sacrifice was necessary for atonement of sins until
right,
Jesus died on the cross. So he actually came to replace that. Was that something that was necessary? Or
yeah,
was that a sinful thing that was brought into it? Because you were saying that before maybe Noah did that first sacrifice, that's where it started. So
yeah.
has that been a sinful interpretation of this religion the entire time? Like,
No,
what
no,
is?
it's just a truthful. It's a true picture of what mankind is stepping out of. There were problems. There were things that mankind got tangled up in, just like free will. It was mankind's destiny. It was God's plan, ultimately, for Eve to bite the fruit. And, we're not going crazy with that. We're not saying we're Luciferians, that free will is now our God or anything, which a lot of the elite do. A lot of the
Mhm.
elite, they exalt that action. They exalt the biting of the fruit to an extreme degree, and make a god out of the serpent, and the free will. But like I said, it's when Noah commits the first animal sacrifice, God says, "Now I will demand blood from you and from your
Okay.
generation." So God puts a debt on Noah from the first sacrifice that never gets paid until Jesus comes. And from the beginning, Noah and his buddies, his kids, they probably weren't sacrificing very much. They did the one. They thought it would impress God, and to an extent it did. But at the same time, by necessity, he had to change the circumstances because they had also violated a previous commandment. Number one, to have dominion over the animals. Just going back to that. Dominion is protecting, and, it's about using discretion and innovation, riding the horse, having the dog, um, all these things we can do with the animals. Each animal has a role, an ability that they can help us with. The ox to pull heavy things for us. Um, that's dominion. You have dominion over your family too. You have dominion over your family. Does it mean that's what they're on the menu? Does it mean that's what's on the menu? Absolutely not. The leopard does not have dominion over his prey. The leopard seeks to seize the life from his prey with no right whatsoever. Now, it's his natural place and the natural order, but he's taking the life, ripping it right out of the living veins of that animal. That's not dominion. If you think that's dominion, you need another, Bible 101 class. Okay? Dominion is the interaction, the responsibility over animals. You know, we had a job to take care of animals. God created man not only to experience his creation through, but also to be the instrument of grace in the lives of animals. Only the human has the discretion to step in and free the bird who's tangled in the vine. Because if this is just the History Channel, just the cameras from far away, just a impersonal view of what's going on, you just leave things to their natural order, and that bird succumbs, dies, crumples up, gets eaten by the bacteria or the maggots, falls down, whatever. Humanity was created to be the instrument of grace, especially Adam. This is Adam. Jesus is almost like the reincarnation of Adam. We call him the new Adam. He's paying for the sins of the original generation. So reincarnation might not be the best word, but just as, John the Baptist is said to be Elijah come again, you know, Jesus is said to be Adam kind of come again, the new Adam, or at least addressing Adam's direct life, his direct. But basically, the dominion is violated. And also God gives another commandment to say, to take care of the animals on the ark, keep them safe, protect them. Now Noah kind of violates that too when he gets off the ark and sacrifices one of them. Now we can sympathize with Noah because the world is destroyed, desolate right after the flood. They don't have their incense burners and all, the other ways of showing gratitude. So they did what they did. They slaughtered an animal. And again, just as Cain killed Abel because mankind didn't really know any better, we had to discover the criminal element. Criminality had to be learned before it could be understood, right? Had to be stumbled into. This is the first taking of an animal's life on purpose, in kind of, for no good reason, dare I say. And we see that God is a little pleased, but he also punishes Noah. That's the implementation of the blood sacrifice system. And that debt, that crushing blood debt, the interest compounds over the generations. And by the time we get to Jesus, they're sacrificing twice a day, sun up and sun down, and pretty much hundreds, thousands of times in between. In Jesus' day, you can find accounts that in Jesus' day, in the apparently the most holy place on earth, 2,000 years ago, on the high temple at Jerusalem, on any given day, you had blood trickling down the steps, pouring out the cracks, coming down gutters at the temple of Jerusalem. They had a corral next to the temple at Jerusalem, filled with unblemished lambs, sheep, cows even, pigeon, turtle doves, all these things. This was like Costco for the animal holocaust, okay? Slaughter, butchery. That's what worship looked like 2,000 years ago. There was no hallelujah, God bless, we're so merry and happy for the gifts of God. No, it was pay now, cough it up, cough up the shekels, pay for your unblemished lamb. Oh, you brought your own lamb? Sorry, we found a blemish on it. You have to pay for ours. Not only were they ripping people off, that pissed off Jesus too.
Yep.
But the extent to which animal sacrifice was crushing the psyche of mankind, crushing the shoulders of mankind, this blood debt, generationally it had compounded. You could never pay this off. Never paid it off since Noah. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they reveled in this. They reveled in the blood. They loved it. The Jesus movement, the John the Baptist, Jesus, and James, the brother of Jesus movement, they saw what was wrong with this. They knew what was wrong with this. And they saw another way. They knew the true way. Bloodless, true worship, right? True grace, right? The true preaching of forgiveness, not the paying of prices, not the paying of a blood debt, which never gets paid off. So yes, Jesus fulfilled in an ancient prophecy to save mankind from this crushing blood debt. And he was also angry that they were, charging, clipping coins and putting, Tyrannian shekels, right? Faces of Caesar, faces of Hercules, faces of, Canaanite gods, Phoenician gods, all Astarte coins. The only shekel that you could use in Jesus' time, I believe, was the Tyrannian shekel, or it was something like that. It was pretty much an adulterous and idolatrous coin that was giving, giving reverence to these pagan gods, or these, Roman rulers, or ancient Greek mythological figures, whatever. Those shekels, which were standardized, pure, not only were they getting clipped, right, and like they're money laundering, they're doing all this stuff, They're overcharging for the animals. They're rejecting people's sacrifices that they brought. They're ripping everyone off on top of the bloody nastiness. And those go hand in hand, right? It's because interest, the concept of interest, was learned through the blood debt. How did mankind learn about, this merchant lifestyle and banking? It all goes back to animal sacrifice. You have shambles when Jesus flips the table of the money changers. It's the table of the butcher and the money changer. They were one and the same.
Yep.
The money changer was often the butcher, often the same priest or the same assistant of the priest or the same group of, people on duty that day. You'd have blood-stained hands doing some of these transactions. And that's why Jesus set free the turtle doves, the pigeons, set free the lambs. And that's why he has one on his back. He put an end to the sacrificial system. Jesus didn't save you from your sins, meaning you can never sin again. Duh. No duh. People are so drunk on this false theology. Jesus didn't save you from sins, meaning you're never going to sin again. Meaning your sins are automatically forgiven forever, right? Just through faith of Christ. Okay, be careful with that, folks. Don't get drunk on that. How many Catholics do we know who purposefully sin, knowing that they can just wash their hands clean of it?
Well, you got to rub the beads too. Then you got to do your Hail Marys, and then you're good.
Yeah, that's Pharisee. That's Sadducee. That's Pharisee Sadducee approach to sin. Now, also you'll see.
I am curious. I want to hear your version. What does it mean to be saved from our sins?
Yeah, Jesus saved us from the obsolete system by which we were previously paying for our sins. So no longer is there a blood debt. He paid off all the past debt. So now everything you accrue, is on you. Jesus coined personal accountability. Jesus literally invented the concept of, in regards to sin, the concept of personal accountability. No longer could you blame your past lives sin or your father's sin and all this, and you didn't have to pay for their shit either. You didn't have to sacrifice for them either. That was a thing that was going on too. Sometimes you'd have to sacrifice for your forefathers. So Jesus saved us from the system, the defunct, obsolete, futile system, corrupt, and Jesus paid the ultimate price for paying that blood debt. So Jesus is our Lord and Savior, the King of Kings. But it's not as easy as people think it is. You don't just say, I believe in Jesus, and then boom, you're sin-free. Boom. No matter how bad it gets, it's all paid off at the end. That's not how it works. It doesn't work.
So no deathbed confessionals are going to save you.
It'll help. But
Yeah.
God knows what's on your heart, but he does want to hear it from you too. So just as Jesus says, God knows what's on your heart, but you need to say it out loud in private too. So there is something to that. You can confess out loud on your own. That's a confession. And what did I believe there's a story of Jesus being offered confession and says, I'll confess, pretty much to myself. I don't need to reflect on anything. I'm not going to rescind anything. I'm not going to, there were kind of some escape routes he could have taken and kind of diffused the system, theologically by saying, oh, well, I really meant this. No, he's stuck with it and, wouldn't take a cop-out or a confession or, rescind anything. So I'd say that just like Jesus says to pray in private, in the prayer closet or something close to that, right? You don't want to pray out loud. That's largely defeats it. We can say grace with each other over food. We can say thanks and stuff, but asking for what you want, God already knows what's on your mind, but going as far to say it out loud means the world. To him, to everyone, it really We know whenever you're in need, whenever you're down, pray out loud to a benevolent creator. Let him know exactly what's getting you down, exactly what's bothering you, what you're up against, even if he already knows it. And the fact that he already knows it should help you get it out and say it out loud, right? And this doesn't have to be in front of anyone. So that's confession. And that does help, you know, kind of diffuse sin or lessen it, and, you know, enrich the relationship between you and God, and, you know, increase your chances of getting forgiven like that. But I also don't believe in this whole saved or not saved bullshit. You know, this whole theology of, you know, minor disputes between the churches result in people being saved or not saved. Absolutely not. You know, acts before faith, right? Before belief. Acts is everything. Faith in Jesus is key too. But if you're using faith in Jesus as a cop-out for worse behavior, which so many Catholics, so many Christians do, knowing that they can confess it off later, congrats, but you're nothing but a Pharisee or a Sadducee at that point. And yeah.
It's all legalism, and there's ways of skirting about it in their minds. Yeah. Yeah. Acts matter, but I mean belief it's both,
Works.
right? It's
Yeah,
faith
works.
and works. Yeah.
Yeah. I
So
wanted to address the Jesus being vegetarian pescatarian thing. I don't think I got to the core of that or explained it. There's only a single instance, or here, we'll say this first. Jesus did feed the people close to him fish. Nowhere does it say that Jesus ate the fish. In fact, a lot of times it says, you know, Jesus kept on fasting even when the others ate. Jesus was a little bit more tired and needed to rest a little bit more than the others. You know, giving the impression he'd stayed up handing it out or preaching the whole time, and like a Italian grandma, you know, didn't leave any for himself, or, you know, ate last of anyone. But Jesus fed, you know, the multitudes fish, not because he thought fish was the proper food or the proper diet or the true Eden diet or anything like that, but because Jesus had more of an issue with animal sacrifice than he did people's, you know, diet. He had a big issue with animal sacrifice. And the idea of feeding people fish was that many of those poor or wanderers or beggars or people who'd come out of the city, you know, came out of Jerusalem to kind of see him, or the neighboring cities, to see him you know, preach, they were very often the lower class that was used to eating the discarded flesh from the temple. That was another thing. The temple, you know, they weren't necessarily supposed to do that. You know, the priests and the royalty usually wouldn't eat the discarded flesh, you know, that was cut up throughout the whole day, butchered after the sacrifices. It's supposed to be like kind of discarded ritually, you know, in the right way. But, you know, eventually there were movements and, you know, groups who just wanted to start eating it and started feeding it and selling it and, you know, making a bunch of money off it, or giving it away to the poor, because there's ultimately so much of it, so much flesh. After a day of operation in the temple at Jerusalem, you're talking about thousands and thousands of pounds of flesh every single day. What would they do with that? Did they drain all the blood perfectly to be suitable to eat as per the Noahide laws? No, but they would give it away to the poor or sell it, you know, at the meat market. And many of those people that Jesus was feeding fish to, people that Jesus, was feeding fish to, they were accustomed to eating flesh from the temple. And we know that eating sacrificed flesh becomes a big, big issue later on between James and Paul. That's one of the first big disagreements that Paul's kind of admonished for, is telling people it's okay to eat flesh, and to eat flesh from the meat markets, to eat flesh from the discarded, temple sacrifice. So Jesus feeds fish, number one, because it doesn't have as much adrenochrome. Number two, can't be sacrificed to a false god. Can't be sacrificed to the devil. Can't be sacrificed. And that's Jesus' position, is that the sacrifice being done on the temple wasn't even going to God. It was going to Saturn. It was going to the demiurge, going to the lesser lord that kind of stands in for God and pretends to kind of be him sometimes. And that is one of God's henchmen. But if we only know God through that one lesser, lord representative, that's a satanic group, right? We need to see the whole picture, not hone in on any one of the planets or any one of the lesser gods. Only the one good God in heaven. You can steer clear of all that nastiness. But Jesus fed fish to people, but he never ate it himself. And as a vegetarian, I'd rather my friends eat fish than lamb. You think Jesus couldn't have, made lamb appear out of nowhere, or, multiply lamb if he wanted to, or picked up a bug and multiplied a bug if he wanted to, caught a bird and multiplied a bird if he wanted to. It's bread and fish. And another easy way out of this, I always want to take people on an even playing field, with the regular old Bible. But an easy way out of that also is, the earlier we go back, and if you compare the Gospels to each other, the original story, the original narrative, earliest narrative, doesn't even have fish in it. We see bread. And then there's also people who argue that fish is just relish. That fish is almost like a little relish that people would make that sometimes had fish, sometimes didn't. But it was something that you'd pair with bread. And that makes a whole lot more sense than dry fish or fresh fish and bread. No butter, no oil, right? Wouldn't be that good of a meal. But, some might say, oh, that's a cope, whatever. But, Jesus didn't eat the fish. We all know that. Didn't say that he ate any fish. When Jesus is around Passover, he doesn't eat any lamb. He provides bread and wine instead. And then also, there's only one instance where Jesus has fish on his tongue. And that's after he's resurrected. He surprises some of the disciples. And they say, it's like Obi-Wan Kenobi in ghost form, kind of just pops in on his friends. And they're like, oh my God, he can talk. We can kind of touch him. But is he real? Is he functioning? Is he just a talking, spirit kind of ghost, deception? Or is that a real person, a real body? So one of the tests they put Jesus through is they drop some of what they are eating, not what Jesus ordered off the menu. They drop some of what they were eating onto Jesus' tongue. It says either a piece of honey and some broiled fish, or boiled fish, or broiled fish, dried fish, different versions of that, but a little bit of fish and honey on Jesus' tongue. Now, I don't know if fish and honey is a good thing, right?
Could be.
But
Chef speaking here, I could make it pretty darn delicious.
Okay. Now, different, ancient Christian experts like James Tabor and, different researchers, they're quick to point out that that word for fish is very, very close to honeycomb. And even when, or something like even a sweet cake, it might have been. Also, when we see ichthys, we got to remember that's the most symbolic word there is for fish. Whereas pesca or pashka, that's where we get fish, like fish on a plate, pescatarian. Ichthys is the Vesica Pisces, is an ichthys. The Jesus fish is an ichthys. Another easy way out of this is to just say that, Jesus was just teaching a Piscean message. He was giving fish to thousands of people. He was teaching the message of the age of Pisces, preaching a new age, disseminating Piscean wisdom. Pisces rules wisdom, Pisces rules forgiveness, Pisces rules washing of feet. Pisces is the feet. Pies, Pisces. Pi, 314, March 14th, this is all Pisces. And peace. Peace is a Pisces word. Pacifism, Jesus isn't totally a pacifist, but largely a pacifist movement. All these are Pisces words. So the Christians with their Pisces fish on the back of their car often demonize astrology. That's the ichthys. That's the symbolic fish that Jesus was handing out. Now, I don't want to rest it on that, the allegory or the metaphor, because I think that's weak. It's not weak, but I want to take people on their level. So if they're going literal, we can critique it literal and show Jesus never ate fish. Now, Jesus, being the Son of God, having already resurrected, I think he's allowed to have a little fish dropped on his tongue. I'm not saying that violates
Jesus a pass on this one.
Yeah, that's not violating his principles, or Jesus can do what he wants to do. I'm not restricting him to my diet or anything. I'm saying that. But let's also say that James, the brother of Jesus, was a lifelong vegetarian. Universally recognized. Universally recognized. There's not a single early Christian church father, heretic or not, who would deny that James was a lifelong vegetarian. Paul.
So, in your opinion, is eating meat, is it kind of is it like a dereliction of our duties as being still supposed to be like
Yeah.
so is it a sin? Is eating meat a sin in your opinion? Is it a dereliction of our duties to still be kind of watchers over the animals and protectors of
Yeah.
the animals? Is it
Personally, it keeps us farther from the Garden of Eden. It keeps us too far from the Garden of Eden. And we know that Jesus preaches that, and I'm not saying this is the apocalypse or the end of the world, but when Jesus gets his way, when Jesus gets what he wants, when his prophecies are kind of fulfilled, we're expecting a lion to lay with the lamb. For the lion or the wolf to lay with the lamb and to eat straw. For the lion to eat straw. If that's not a full 360, full return back to the Garden of Eden, I don't know what it is. And we also know that Jesus was vegetarian because of his teachings on divorce. Jesus did not cite the law for his reasoning or his theology or his teachings. He always cited the original factory settings of mankind. So we call him the new Adam because his fulfilling of the law was not the destruction of the law. It was the full 360, returning it back to its beginning and completing, fulfilling the law. Right? Fulfill does not mean, if you fulfill something, that doesn't keep going. That's fulfilled. That's made whole. And Jesus made the sacrificial system whole. Now, you don't have to be a vegetarian to be a Christian. That's Paul's message. That's Paul's movement. And Paul ultimately won out and made, his vision of Christianity being a state religion, a widespread, a sea that overswept the earth. I think God had favor with that message and that vision. And even though Paul was pretty hard on vegetarians and said, they had weak faith, right? He's calling out James, the brother of Jesus, who was thinking about or had already kicked him out of the church. That's why Paul went out on his own. To your question, I think eating flesh is a sin. It certainly breeds a sinful nature. Now, all the best people I've ever met, most virtuous, most wise, have been holistic vegetarians. Not Starbucks vegans, not, Impossible Burger, bug, cricket meals, lab meat, none of that shit. Holistic vegetarians. The person who we bought my bookstore from, my brother and I, purchased a bookstore, and we run a bookstore. The man who ran that for 50 years, a Christian vegetarian, a Christian mystic vegetarian, conservative, radical Republican, that's the best mix, I think, in my mind. Traditional Christian values are traditional vegetarian values, as per the Garden of Eden, as per Jesus' vision of the lion, prophecy, lion laying with the lamb. But also, what are Jesus' teachings on divorce? That we need to go back to the original. We need to go back to the Garden of Eden. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, try and say, oh, but God made an allowance for divorce. You need to let us divorce. You need to let people get divorced. You need to quit critiquing people like Herod or whoever took the brother's wife, or had multiple wives, and was cheating or getting rid of his old wives, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees are saying, stop critiquing people, stop criticizing people for getting divorced when God made allowances for it. Look at the law. Hello, trying to refute Jesus and embarrass him. And Jesus said, God did that because of the hardness of your hearts. He allowed that to happen. A lowering of the bar. Jesus came back to set the bar high, in many ways, to return it to the original Adamic standard. So, this is indirect reasoning, but by looking at his teachings on divorce, we can get a really clear picture as to why his family, especially James, his brother, was a lifelong vegetarian. Now, I think most Christians and the early Christians were too pussy to really emphasize this, that Jesus was a vegetarian. So it did slip through the cracks because everyone wanted to keep eating flesh. And if everyone knew Jesus was a vegetarian, very few people would be comfortable. Very few Christians would be comfortable eating flesh. To walk like Jesus, in my mind, is to not eat flesh. Because what is James doing? Is James just off on his own universe? Did James have a separate pair of parents from Jesus? Well, spiritually, maybe. But no. Same parents, same lifestyle, same upbringing. And everyone knows this. I'm really just trying to argue with the Christians who don't know the Bible well, who don't know biblical archaeology well at all. These are the only people who need to be persuaded. Everyone knows the early Christians were vegetarians. For example, the pre-Christian, Jewish movements that Jesus was interacting with, there was two main sects of Judaism, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and we see him admonishing them throughout the gospel. That leads us to believe that Jesus was closer to the Essenian tradition, not an Essene completely. Also, there's the matter of Nazarite creeds, right? Well, there's Nazarite, there's also Nazarene. Nazarene means vegetarian. A Nazarite creed is almost like a Buddhist thing, shave your head and take some vows. And, the Nazarene creed, the Nazarenes, they're hardcore vegetarians. And this is a Jewish sect local to Jesus' hometown. He was born in Bethlehem, but his hometown, the family, the community's Nazareth. So the Nazarenes were a especially vegetarian community sect of Judaism, not modern day Judaism at all, which is rabbinic Judaism through the Pharisees. Okay, the Jews of today are just the Pharisees of the Bible. It's one sect that went us one direction, blossomed out into the modern day Jewish population. Through conversion or not doesn't matter. It's a matter for another day, But the original Jesus movement, John the Baptist, he's eating crickets, right? Cricket, that's one of the only easy mistranslations in the Bible. It's clearly honey and honey cake, because no crazy person's eating crickets. No crazy person's eating crickets with honey. But, so yeah, that's basically, the Nazarenes were vegetarians. Jesus it's not explicitly written, but it's pretty easy to deduce. He was closer to the Nazarenes and the Essenes in his inspiration. And also the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran, right? John the Baptist came out of that movement. They were hardcore vegetarians. They were militant vegetarians. They were like Spartans. They would train and with weapons and all this stuff. And John came out of that movement because he probably didn't want to be caught up in the war fighting and battles. And so John goes out on his own, and Jesus is with John to start off with. That's a vegetarian movement. There are a bunch of hippies out in the wilderness, eating like hippies, vegetarian, and the crickets. That's BS. That's BS. The crickets. Okay, he ate crickets. Whatever. That's not flesh. But it's not crickets. It's honey and honey cake. It's a very easy mistranslation to understand if you go look at it. They call it acris. It's a matter of one letter, acris or acressa, acris. This Aramaic word for cricket or grasshopper or locust. It's really locust bean or like a little honey cake that would go with the honey. Same with the fish and the bread. It's probably relish and bread, but I'm not gonna say that's how everyone needs to interpret it. It doesn't really matter. But that's
Doc, I still have so many more questions for you. We're already past 2 hours. We're
okay.
just gonna have to do this again, brother. Yeah, I want to talk to you about the Trinity. I want to talk to you about because I'm a weirdo Christian that kind of has a belief in reincarnation. I want to talk to you about those sort of
Yeah.
questions. I want to talk to you about heaven and hell because there is a lot of thoughts on that. I want to talk to you about like early Christianity and the idea of like socialism. That not the socialism that we see today or know today, but like sharing everything as a community and things like that. And I think that's kind of interesting. I want to talk to you about the Eucharist. Uh, dude, there's a ton of things that we need to talk about. So, dude, if
Okay.
you're down, we should do a part two, maybe in a few weeks or something like that.
Sure, I'm down. I agree. A lot more to talk about. Yeah.
But you are kind of blowing my mind. I really appreciate it. I totally have a much better idea of what you mean by Christians should be vegetarians now. It makes a lot of sense to me. Um,
Well,
I'm gonna
I
have to
gotta
deal
say
with
this.
that.
I gotta say one thing because I've got to bring the truth on this. Vegetarianism is not going to automatically make you a better person. That's why Paul's movement ultimately succeeded in one. Paul wanted everyone to be able to join and to come in, and he wanted faith. And he didn't maybe emphasize works as much as I would say, but vegetarianism doesn't make you a good person. So that's one of the key things that I need to say. A disclaimer, and it's not the most important thing in being a vegetarian. Far from it. Virtue comes first. It's simply that I think a blood-free diet promotes virtue more than anything else. All of the ancient philosophers agreed. Plato, Socrates, Theophrastus, the Neoplatonists, even Nietzsche came around to this. All the greatest thinkers, Da Vinci.
Every shamanic tradition as well to really like to become a spiritually in tuned, you have to go vegetarian.
Yeah. Tesla, Einstein, Richard Wagner even came around to this. Um, a little mustache man who had some, genius ideas. They taught us in school he was a genius. They taught us in school he was a genius. They just said he was an evil genius. Okay? But many, many geniuses, all the world's greatest geniuses, have all been vegetarian. Even Einstein. I'm not an Einstein guy, but, all great playwrights, thinkers, but really the philosophers. And it's the philosopher diet. So maybe the carpenter and the laborer, maybe they should want to steal their nutrients from the animals because they don't need to, access the higher truths and whatever. And I'm not trying to shit on them, but vegetarianism doesn't make you better. I think it promotes better. It promotes natural living, and ultimately, flesh diet's an adrenochrome addiction. It's not the natural state of mankind. So that's it.
Yeah. I mean, you made that case very well that it is not the natural diet that we were made to eat. And then also, I thought you did a fantastic job bringing in astrology to the Christian world. So I think that that was very important. Thank you, Doctor. This was a great time. I appreciate the conversation, man. We should definitely do this again. And thank you.
Thanks to
Uh,
you, Nick. Thanks for being
uh,
a great host.
yeah, absolutely, brother. And for any of my audience that hasn't heard of you, what's the best place to support you? What's the name of your bookshop, dude? If I ever go to Florida, I want to go hang out. I want to see what kind of cool books you got.
Come on in, man. You're welcome. We're the Dancing Elephant Bookstore in Palm Beach County, so really close to Trump's house. We're in Lake Worth Beach, but it's Palm Beach County. So if you fly into West Palm Beach, that's where we are. And I run the Old World Florida YouTube channel. Got an Instagram, Old World Florida, X, Twitter. Fuck Elon Musk, he sucks. But
He really sucks.
Rumble, I'm on too, Old World Florida. But I'm at the bookstore Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The weekends if anyone wants to come in. So.
Heck yeah, man. Well, Doc, I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you, Nate. Good to see you again. Peace.
Peace.
Reality stars, where reality stars. You know who we are. We're reality stars.
If you enjoyed this content, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating for Reality Czars wherever you are listening to this podcast. If you like the music and visuals, visit paranoidamerican.com for more.